Hi folks, I'm Andre, and I'm the lead gameplay designer for League of Legends. We've recently just put out our preseason patch for the year, and preseasons and mid-seasons are sort of the times where we can make bigger changes to the game, sort of improve things long-term, or address issues that are too disruptive to be dealt with during the year, the removal of Aegis Aura, for example. And recently we've been receiving a bunch of questions about how we feel this preseason's gone, what's been good, what's missed. And I wanted to sort of share some thoughts with you, because that's a great question, about the lessons we've taken away from preseason. This preseason gave us some sort of valuable lessons around how we communicate stuff to players. Let's say a new champion, a good approach can often be to sort of start gradually, revealing information slowly, sort of teasing, here's a comic, here are some ability details, here's some backstory, here's finally them on the PBE. And that can be sort of a pretty fun journey for people that are interested and engaged with that concept. By contrast, for say broader gameplay changes, such as plants or masteries or whatever, we think it's much more important in retrospect to sort of give people all the context they need to understand how this thing works, what its impact will be, etc. right up front. And in retrospect with plants, we didn't do a great job of that. Our initial communication was pretty light on the details, talking more about the removal of smite buffs than plants themselves and how they work, what they're meant to do, etc., which left a number of people uncertain or pretty doubtful on them, understandably. So what we'd like to do in the future is find better ways to give people the full context, all the details about some of our changes when we're doing things like plants or masteries or whatever. Maybe that means sort of videos of full playtest games, you can actually get a real feel for what these things are like in sort of realistic game setting. Or maybe that means we need to get stuff onto the PBE, really shortly after we've sort of been talking about it and revealing it initially. But doing things like that should lead to sort of, we think, much sort of clearer discussions and sort of do a better job on our part of giving you guys the context you need to understand what we're trying to do, at least. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the class updates and what we've learned from those, both in the Assassin update itself and looking back at some of the previous ones. Something the Assassin update really reinforced for us was the value of what we've been calling thematic resonance. Basically that the changes we're making to a champion's kit, it's really important that they reflect the theme and the personality of the character. That's something we've put a lot of focus on with new champions already, and this has sort of really driven home to us the value of keeping that sort of focus when we're updating existing characters, even in a small way. Things like the wall jumping on Talon, or the blade pickups on Katarina is both really well tied in with their theme, their personality, the sort of feel you get off them. Make those feel much more sort of natural and intuitive. In part because I think in some of the past ones, especially the older ones, we sort of sometimes missed that, going for novelty or distinctiveness at the expense of things that felt right on the champion. Skarner's crystals probably being the strongest example of that, of something that does create distinctive gameplay, but doesn't really feel right for him or how he plays. Another thing the Assassin update really emphasized for us was the value of making high skill curves on champions really apparent to everybody in the game. Katarina, for example, has a much more sort of difficult mastery curve than she used to. There was already a moderate amount there. We've added some extra on as well, though, but it's been done in a way that is really sort of apparent to both the Cat player and to everybody else in the game, whether she's doing really well, doing really poorly. That means you play around it, you can sort of celebrate those successes, or celebrate those cases where you shut her down really hard. By contrast, in our sort of previous update with the mages, we added some mastery curve to Vladimir, for example, but it's done in a less apparent way. And that can make it somewhat more difficult to sort of make a champion both balanced and sort of appreciable in terms of what they're doing. So going forwards, we're very much going to sort of put a lot of focus on getting those skill curves really visible to other people in game. In terms of the changes to support items, thinking Redemption and Knight's Vow primarily, there's a couple of things there that are sort of big takeaways for us. The first is the value of support items that have really apparent power. This is something we talk about internally quite a lot anyway, sort of the difference between invisible power and really appreciable visible power. But say Redemption is a great example of how much better something that's really sort of concentrated and well communicated can feel than say an invisible aura that, while it may be as powerful or more powerful, doesn't feel anywhere near as good. The other thing that was reinforced for us was the value of items that are really tailored to what you want to be doing as a champion. Knight's Vow is a good example of that. If you're buying that on somebody like Braum or Alistair, it lets you soak even more damage for your allies, and then lets them sort of help you out at the same time. Similarly, if you're playing Soraka and you want even more healing, Redemption can be a great way to sort of double down on that. Compared to items that are much more just sort of raw stat-based, harder to feel power, but also just sort of equally good on everybody, we sort of feel that much more tailored items give you a much, generally sort of better and more appreciated experience. So pre-seasons tend to be times when the game's balance gets a little bit out of whack for a while. There's a lot of stuff changing at once. And that was actually a bit harder than normal again this year, since we were introducing a new queue and doing some MMR resetting at the exact same time those gameplay changes were going out. So that meant that for a sort of a couple of week period there, it was a bit harder for us to get a sort of a good read on what was out of line and what we should be changing. Because of that, we're actually going to be doing a balance hotfix a week after patch 624 to try and catch some of those outstanding balance sort of problems. We'd originally planned for 624 to be the final balance patch of the year, but it looks like there's a few things that we should address that we won't have in that patch. Nidalee, for example, is probably underperforming pretty hard in the new jungle, so we want to take the opportunity to sort of patch that sort of stuff up, rather than just leaving it over the entire holiday period. Something else we've also been trying to focus on more this preseason is making systemic changes, to items or masteries, before we change champions. This time this means looking at things like Courage of the Colossus, which has been way too strong, or Fervor of Battle, too weak, Blade of the Ruined King, also too weak, and addressing those in a patch and then looking at individual champions that are also affected by them later. The goal there is to not, overly nerf a champion when the item was actually the problem, or, overbuff or fail to buff a champion enough when we should have been addressing that sort of foundational stuff first. Finally, this preseason has also been a really good reminder to us of the value of getting people from outside of Riot in to playtest our content really regularly and consistently. In particular, sort of the right people who have, deep knowledge of the champions we're reworking, or a good understanding of the game, who can deliver that feedback in really, sort of constructive and useful ways. Skara on Katarina was a really great example of that. He's played a lot of Cat, he understands the game well, guy communicates really well too, and we got him in to play a couple of work-in-progress kits, which was really helpful, both as sort of a gut check on, hey, where are we going, and what sort of impacts do we think this sort of stuff will have. That's something we're going to be looking to do much more consistently next year. It's something we've done intermittently in the past, and I think would benefit an awful lot from sort of really focusing on more in the future. So those are the big things that have been on our minds in terms of sort of lessons from gameplay changes in this year's preseason. We're certainly not done in terms of follow-up work for it though. We've both got some more balanced stuff coming shortly, and then a bunch of sort of both balance and tuning sort of follow-up early next year. I hope this has been a sort of an interesting and helpful look at some of the stuff we've been thinking about, and thank you for watching.